A 10-year-old sits down to do homework and can't focus for more than 5 minutes without getting up, forgetting the task, or drifting into daydreams. That same evening, he sits down to play a strategy video game, and stays locked in, completely focused, without moving, for nearly 3 hours straight. To a tired parent watching this happen night after night, the conclusion seems obvious. He clearly can focus. He's just choosing not to on homework. Welcome back to the channel. That conclusion feels logical, and it's also one of the most common, and most damaging, misunderstandings about ADHD in children. ADHD, Attention Deficit/Hyperactivity Disorder, is one of the most common neurodevelopmental conditions diagnosed in childhood, affecting roughly 1 in 10 children, according to U.S. health data. But long before it had that name, or any real scientific framework, children showing these exact behaviors were already being closely observed, and badly misunderstood. In 1902, British pediatrician Sir George Still delivered a series of lectures to the Royal College of Physicians, describing 20 children who were impulsive, restless, and unable to sustain attention. Still noted something important. Even then, these children were, in his words, of normal intelligence, and their behavior didn't seem to come from their home environment. And yet the label he gave the condition was an abnormal defect of moral control, as if the core problem were a child's character, rather than their brain. That single phrase, moral control, would go on to shape how these children were treated for the next 100 years, as lazy, defiant, or simply poorly raised. Even after science moved past moral control as an explanation, the underlying assumption often didn't. Parents were blamed for being too permissive. Kids were labeled troublemakers. One especially persistent myth blamed sugar. The idea that too much sugar, or certain food dyes, directly caused hyperactive behavior in children. But when researchers tested this directly, in controlled studies where neither parents nor children knew which snacks contained sugar, the effect consistently failed to show up. The behavior parents were seeing was real. The explanation, sugar as the cause, simply wasn't holding up under closer examination. So if it isn't sugar, and it isn't bad parenting, and it clearly isn't a lack of ability to focus, since the same child can focus intensely on a video game, what's actually going on? The clue was hiding in plain sight the entire time, inside the very contradiction that confused everyone in the first place: intense focus on one task, and almost none on another. Modern researchers have increasingly pointed to differences in how the ADHD brain regulates dopamine, a neurotransmitter closely tied to motivation, reward, and the drive to start a task. This research is still evolving, and scientists continue debating the exact mechanisms. But a consistent picture has emerged. The brain's dopamine system often responds differently to everyday motivation. Psychiatrist Dr. William Dodson built on this research to describe something he calls the interest-based nervous system, a term that reframes the entire conversation around attention. According to Dodson, most people run on what he calls an importance-based nervous system. If a task matters, a deadline, a responsibility, that importance alone is often enough to generate motivation. But for many people with ADHD, importance alone doesn't reliably switch the brain on. Something else has to be present first. Dodson identified 4 things that reliably activate an ADHD brain: genuine interest, novelty, real challenge, or urgency, sometimes remembered by the acronym ICNU. A homework worksheet, by design, often contains none of these. It isn't new. It isn't especially challenging in an exciting way. And with hours left before bedtime, there's no real urgency yet. A strategy video game, on the other hand, hits nearly all 4 at once: genuinely interesting, constantly novel, meaningfully challenging, and often urgent, moment to moment. This is why the exact same child, with the exact same brain, can sit motionless for 3 hours in front of a screen, and yet be unable to sit still for 10 minutes with a worksheet. It was never a measure of how much willpower he had. It was a measure of how differently his brain responds to 2 very differently designed tasks. This reframing matters enormously, because for over a century, the dominant explanation ran in the opposite direction entirely. If a child could focus on something, The assumption went, then a lack of focus elsewhere must be a choice: laziness, defiance, or simply not trying hard enough. But if attention itself is regulated differently, not switched off, just switched on by different triggers, then just try harder was never actually addressing what was happening. It's a bit like blaming someone for not starting a car with the wrong key, without ever checking whether they'd actually been handed the right one. This also helps explain why the name attention deficit can be a little misleading. It isn't that attention is simply missing, or reduced across the board. It's that attention is harder to direct toward tasks that don't naturally trigger interest, novelty, challenge, or urgency, and once directed elsewhere, can be genuinely hard to redirect. None of this means every child who dislikes homework has ADHD, or that hyperfocus alone is a diagnosis. ADHD is a clinical condition, assessed by trained professionals looking at a fuller picture. But for children who are already diagnosed, or clearly struggling in this exact pattern, this reframing changes what kind of support actually helps, and what quietly makes things worse. Punishing a child for not trying on homework, while praising the same child for finally focusing on a game, sends a confusing, often painful message about their character. Over time, many children internalize that message. A difference in brain wiring can slowly turn into something heavier: shame, low self-worth, a belief that they're fundamentally lazy or broken. And this is really the deeper insight underneath the whole story. What looked, for over 100 years, like a defect of moral control, was never actually about morals at all. It was about which specific ingredients, interest, novelty, challenge, urgency, a task needs to contain, before a particular brain can fully switch on and stay engaged. Once that distinction is clear, the more useful question stops being "why won't you focus?" and becomes something far more practical: what would make this task easier for your brain to engage with? That single shift in framing, from character flaw to brain wiring, is often the difference between a child feeling broken and a child feeling understood. In practice, this doesn't mean every boring task magically disappears. Homework, chores, and responsibilities still need to get done, in a world mostly built around importance-based motivation. But it does mean some tasks can be deliberately redesigned, adding a timer for urgency, turning a chore into a small challenge, or breaking work into novel, bite-sized pieces. A worksheet done first to the timer suddenly borrows a little of a video game's urgency. A chore turned into a small competition suddenly borrows a little of its challenge. None of this is about tricking a child into behaving. It's about meeting a genuinely different nervous system with tools that actually match how it works. If you're a parent, teacher, or simply someone who loves a child who struggles this way, the most powerful shift may not be a new chart or reward system at all. It may simply be retiring, once and for all, the century-old idea that a child who can't focus on the right things is somehow lacking in character. That idea was wrong in 1902, when it was first written down as a defect of moral control, and it's just as wrong today, even dressed up in more modern language. The child who couldn't sit still for homework, but sat motionless for 3 hours with a game controller, was never lazy for a single moment of either. So tell us, have you seen this exact contradiction play out in your own life, or in a child you know? Total focus on one thing, and none at all on another? Write it in the comments below. Thanks for spending 10 minutes with us today. See you next time.